Salam Shudobisa. Good evening. You are welcome in our university. Thank you very much for coming and for your interest. And it's a great honor for us to host you here in our university and our institute. And before your lecture, I will say some words about your activities, your biography, and about your today's talk. Professor Paul Shore is a life member of the Wolfson College of the University of Cambridge, adjunct professor of religious studies, University of Regina and Brandon University in Canada. He has been working as a visiting scholar and professor in several universities, among them University of Oxford Faculty of Theology and Religion, Modern European History, Research Center Faculty of History, University of the same university, University of Cambridge Faculty of History, University of Durham, Ludwig Boltzmann Institute für Neulatinische Studien, Innsbruck, Austria, the Jesuit Institute, Boston College, University of St. Andrews, Scotland, Central European University, Budapest, Hungary. He has also received several grants and awards from Splendid Trust, International Institute of Islamic Thought, Fulbright Stipend, Corvina Foundation Research Grant, etc. Among publications of Professor Shore, it can be cited The Years of Suppression, 1773-1814, Survival, Setback and Transformation, published in Brill Research Perspective in Jesuit Studies, the series, Narrative of Adversity, Jesuits in the Eastern Periphery of the Habsburg Realms, published in Budapest Central European University Press, The Eagle and the Cross, Jesuits in Late Baroque Prague, St. Louis, published in Institute of Jesuit Sources, Rest Lightly, a collection of Latin and Greek tomb inscription, also, and Contacts, Confrontation, Accommodation, Jesuits and Islam in 1540, 1773, etc. The title of today's presentation is From Classical Arabic to Baroque Latin, Quranic Translations and the Counter-Reformation Mind. This study includes an examination of Lomenili's syntactical and lexical choices of translators, and as well as his attempts to present the content of the Quran to the Christian audience. It must be stressed that Prof. Shore is preparing now a monograph on this topic. Well, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Institute of Oriental Studies here in Tbilisi, and particularly thanks to George. We've just met an hour or two ago, but we've been emailing for months, or maybe it's years, trying to work out how to make this event possible in these rather challenging times. So I'm delighted to be here and delighted to share with you what I've been working on. Today, I'm going to talk mostly about the first of these two personalities. You may know, if you're a person who works with Quranic translation, you may know a little bit about Dominicus Germanus de Cilicia, and I will use him as a sort of foil. He's a fairly well-known personality to compare him with Lomellini, but most of what I have to say is about the gentleman at the top, Ignazio Lomellini, who a few years ago I'd never heard of, and no one I knew had ever heard of this fellow. He's a bit of a man of mystery. He was a Jesuit. He lived to be about 80 years old. He was born of a very distinguished clan in Genoa that had produced several doges, a number of cardinals, and many other prominent people. He entered the Jesuits at the age of 23, which in our 21st century time may not seem like a very strange moment to embark on a career, age 23. It's extremely late for a Jesuit in the early modern period. We don't know, usually they're joining at the age of 15, 16, sometimes even 14. We don't know what Lomellini did previous to these years when he joined the society, which if we knew, we might have some better idea of his interest in the language, Arabic, and in Islam more specifically, but that information is not recorded in the paperwork that survives in the Jesuit archive in Rome. Once he joined the Society of Jesus, he remained in Rome for most of the rest of his life, which is many decades. And in that regard, he is different from Dominicus, whom I just mentioned, who actually traveled to Arabic-speaking lands and majority Muslim lands. Lomellini, like the much better known Lodovico Maracci, who produced a very famous Latin translation of the Quran, Lomellini spent his entire life in Italy, as far as we know, and that raises questions about how he acquired Arabic and what things he got right and wrong about Arabic. About 6 years ago, one evening, as so many of us do, I was surfing the net and I ran across a reference to Jesuits and Islam in a footnote of an online article, and there was this man's name, Lomellini. I'd never heard of him. I contacted the author, and that author, Oscar de la Cruz Palma of the University of Barcelona, very generously shared hundreds of images that he had of a manuscript that basically nobody else knew about. And that manuscript, which is still housed in the University of Genoa library and runs to 323 two-sided folia, is a translation of the Quran, and I'm just going to refer to it here as Anima ad Versiones. It has a very long Baroque title that you'll forget immediately, just as I have, but it is that's the name of the document. It is a unique document. It contains the entire text of the Quran in Arabic, and as such, since it is dated 1622, is, to the best of my knowledge, the oldest translation of the Quran by a Western European to include the entire Arabic text. That in itself makes it significant. The other 3/4 of the document are a translation into Latin of the Arabic and extensive commentaries that Lomellini prepared after translating chunks of 3 or 4 or 5 ayat at a time. As I said, Lomellini, however, despite his years of effort producing this document, remains a person of mystery, although he lived in the time when the Jesuits were publishing materials constantly. No other published works are attributed to him, and no mention of his translation project or even his knowledge of Arabic appears in the surviving documents in Rome about his life. It's normal in Jesuit records, they report year by year in this period on your health, on various things that you are relatively good at, musical instruments that you might play, and always languages, where your ability in a language is ranked from mediocritor all the way up to bellissimo, or whatever the superlative might be. No mention of his knowledge of Arabic. One possible reason for this, well, I guess 2 related reasons. One is that the Quran was actually on the Index Prohibitorum at this point. And so it might not be good to advertise, for the Jesuits to advertise that one of their own is spending weeks and months and years with this particular document. The other factor that causes this document to vanish from sight for literally hundreds of years is Lomellini had a patron, and that patron was Cardinal Alessandro Orsini, whose name you may know because he is a defender of Galileo, and one of what might be considered one of the more liberal and outward-looking members of the College of Cardinals in the early 17th century. Unfortunately, a few years after Lomellini's manuscript, which is dedicated to Cardinal Orsini. After that manuscript is completed, Orsini dies. He's still in his 30s, and that protector disappears, and that may explain the mystery that's connected with this manuscript. Now, very quickly, just for comparison, Germanus de Cilicia, who's a Franciscan. As you might guess, he came from Silesia, part that is now in Poland. He traveled extensively in the Middle East. He even traveled as far as Tartary. He had a very powerful patron as well. For years, he lived in El Escorial. He just didn't report there. He apparently lived there. At the court of Philip IV, who was his personal patron, shortly before his death, Germanus produced an Interpretatio El Corani, which is his translation, and it is very suggestive of the state of studies of Quranic translations. This manuscript was not unknown, it was not missing, but it sat in two libraries until the early 21st century and was only published in 2009. So I guess two characteristics of the research area of studying modern Quranic translations is, one, it's a very, very recent field. There hasn't been a lot of research done on early translations until a few decades ago. And secondly, those translations themselves mostly lie 1,000 years or more after the revelation of the Quran. So the translation history and the scholarship connected to that history has a very different pattern than, say, studying translations of Caesar's commentaries might. Trying to give you a flavor of how Jesuits like Lomellini approached the Ottoman culture in an era when Turk and Muslim were terms that were frequently used interchangeably. I'm going to turn to just a bit of art for a moment. This is an illustration, the frontispiece of an important Jesuit martyrology, which was produced towards the end of the 17th century. And what you've got here, I think your picture, well, it's a little hard to see. Could we dim the lights just for a moment? Is it possible? So that you can have a look at this. Thank you. I'll put them, that's better, much better. Thank you so much. What you've got here is, in the middle, the apotheosis of the society. You then have a sort of Roman-looking amphitheater with a few people watching. You have ferocious lions prancing about, a few evil cherubim, but you also have a bunch of bones lying on the surface of the Colosseum here. Bones of the martyrs, presumably. There's also a monstrous creature like a griffin on the left-hand side who isn't a lion. All of which makes a lot of sense with the Jesuit view that their undertaking, the Society of Jesus, is in some way recapitulating the early history of the Christian church. However, let's take a close look at the tyrant who is the center of this Roman spectacle. He doesn't look very Roman, and neither do the people immediately around him. He looks much more like a Turkish pasha. The point being that the Jesuits, in their first century and century and a half of missionary activity, they were constantly looking for the equivalent of a Constantine, the equivalent of a Roman emperor whom they might convert and thereby save an entire empire. And in this illustration, we see the conflation of a Roman tyrant, someone like Diocletian, with a Turkish pasha. The idea being that in some ways the Ottoman Empire could be saved in the same way that the Roman Empire had been saved through the conversion of Constantine in the 4th century. And this mixing of metaphors, if you will run through Lomellini's work. I'm just going to touch on a few features of his translation. Let me just first of all say his translation is overall quite good, and his transcription, if indeed he made it himself, which I think he did, is, to my inspection, almost entirely free of error. But I just want to point out that occasionally he does curious things grammatically into Latin. We have a phrase here which functions in the Arabic as a mansub, and he translates it caruno vel quaruno, which looks vaguely ablative in Latin for some reason, but then he goes back into following literally a much more literal grammatical model following the Arabic. This is something that I think is a product of Lomellini's classical education in his early training as a Jesuit. The idea that you can step outside of a word for word, verbum pro verbo, and also grammar for grammar model periodically, but you must return to the literal model whenever you can. And I just offer this as a quick glimpse before we jump in further. Okay, now just a little quick look at the actual manuscript. This is interesting to me because it contains one of the very few errors. You will see just about in the middle of the image here that something is crossed out. And I also want to mention another feature of investigating this document. The images that I obtained of it were digitized images from a microfilm that was made in probably the early 1960s in the University of Genoa library. And as you will see later, there's damage done to the microfilm image from the gears of the microfilm. You will see horizontal lines dragging along that have nothing to do with the manuscript. The original plan in the preparation of the monograph that George mentioned was that I would eventually have images that were direct photos made from the manuscript itself. Owing to the coronavirus and basically the complete shutdown of Italian university library facilities for 15 months, I don't yet have those, and so you're going to be seeing digitized images of this much earlier document. Now, one of the things that Lomellini has to deal with is when he runs into Hypox Lagaminon, words that occur either only once in the Quran or occur so seldom that he is really unable to extract meaning from context. In the 18th surah, there is a passage where Suleiman is addressing birds, talking to birds. And there's a bird that surfaces here, which he translates as the upupum vel galum silvestre. Without reading this all to you, you can read it yourself. It's really interesting in that he's created a word. Galum silvestre sometimes could mean pheasant in modern language, but he's casting about from context to try to figure out what this unfamiliar name of a particular species might be. In other places where he encounters the pomegranate, and I noticed that here in Tbilisi there are pomegranate stands where you can actually get one squeezed and get fresh pomegranate juice, and I'm going to have to do that very soon because that looked really good. But he doesn't know what a pomegranate is. And he has all sorts of ideas. Is this a tobacco plant? What could this be? He has no context of understanding what it might be. He's basically guessing. And you'll see this all the way through his document, is that he's trying to make guesses frequently for names of plants, animals, and minerals that are guesswork. He has some other sources that he can draw on. I'm still speaking of Lomellini here. Interestingly, although Lomellini says he has 3 Qurans at his disposal to look at as he does his work. And these are loans from his patron, the cardinal. There's no evidence that Lomellini had access to, or if he did, had interest in any hadith or any commentaries on the Quran. Instead, he relies entirely on Christian documents. And I just put this up here for 2 reasons. One is that it's a reference to Frater Recoldus, a well-known personality who 400 years earlier had gone to, he calls it Baldah, that's Baghdad, a real personality, historical personality, who'd become fluent in Arabic. And he's obviously got some of Recoldus's documents at hand to explain and to explicate difficult passages. That's pretty straightforward. But at the bottom, and if anyone has any ideas about this, I would be very open to your ideas and suggestions. He also is commenting on a Tractatus Mortis, which he has at hand, which is apparently a book about Islamic practice, but I've been unable to isolate what that book is. There are many, many books with the title Tractatus Mortis, as you might guess. But which one he is making reference to, it's very, very hard to know. But this is from his commentaries. So this is something that he is making almost as a note to himself. Elsewhere, other interesting directions that he takes, he translates the word jinn, as in genie, as diabolus all the way through. That's perhaps not that shocking. He compares the Unitarian notion of Islam constantly with Unitarian rivals or threats to Catholicism, in particular the Arians, who is that's the name that he gives to European Unitarians of his own time. And I think in many ways, since this Latin translation would have been intended for a European Christian audience, he's at some pains to speak about Arians as well. I think that's actually quite significant. He calls Muhammad throughout this work the auctor, the author. He regards Muhammad as a spinner of fables, as a person who has made up mendacia, lies, as a misinformed leader of a secta, a sect. All that said, whenever Allah is referenced in the text, and even when Allah is not literally referenced but implied, he translates Allah as Deus, which of course, as a Christian Catholic priest, is a word he would use for God in the celebration of the Eucharist. So this reveals a very interesting dynamic that I think both Germanus and Lomellini must cope with. On the one hand, they and other Christian translators of the Quran in this period are committed to disproving the Quran and discrediting the Quran. At the same time, there are personalities and events and narratives that occur that are very close to those reported in the Christian Bible. And the translator then has to decide if they're going to call Allah Deus or pseudo-Deus. Are they going to call Isa, Jesus, whose name appears, I believe, 63 times in the Quran, are they going to call him Jesus? Are they going to call him Christus, Messiah? And you'll see how the sort of choices that Lomellini makes. The challenge of working on a document such as the Quran for a Jesuit of this period is in fact much more demanding than the translation of Confucian documents into Latin by Lomellini's contemporaries in China. The easy way of describing that, thank you, is that simply Islam is both literally and in some cases theologically too close for comfort. Here's a story which occurs in the Torah and thus becomes part of Christian scripture. Moses casting down a staff in a competition with Pharaoh's magicians and wise men. In the telling in the Quran, 27:10, the staff begins to writhe like a serpent. Lomellini, whose knowledge of Arabic in some places is perhaps a bit limited, he's looked at the adjective describing what the staff is doing, Janu, and he correlates that correctly with the word jinn, which he has been translating as diabolus. And so he ends up with a translation, veluti diabolus. The staff, when set down, is shape-shifting, if you want to use a modern term, just as a jinn might. By comparison, Germanus decides his literature, his resources tell him that it is a serpent. Where he gets domestico, I'm not sure, but he's added that. And then Marachi, the very late 17th century translator, also recognizes that it's a serpent, much less than a jinn, and goes with quasi ipsi esset angios, another word in Latin for a serpent. A whole presentation could be assembled just comparing how these three translators, when they encounter a passage that has lexical challenges or syntactical challenges, how they go off in rather different directions. But I just wanted to give a very quick glimpse of that. Okay, and now to show you more of the manuscript. Again, this is the digital image from the microfilm. And there's a couple of things worth noting. First of all, this is the beginning of Surah 37. And for each surah, Lomellini transcribes, after numbering it, the Arabic word for the surah, and then he also offers his best shot at a translation. And then he goes directly into the first few ayat, transcribing them in Arabic and then translating them in Latin. And on the one hand, you could look at this translation, which begins towards the bottom third of the image here, and you're confronted with all these crossed out passages. And it can be kind of a nightmare, no matter how big you blow up this digital image, trying to figure out what Lomellini had first selected and then what he had crossed out. But there's a silver lining to this cloud, because unlike the published translations of people, or cleaned up translations, this is a snapshot of a translation in progress. This shows what the translator thought, then he changed his mind, then he tried something else. In a number of cases, he goes back to the first word that he had used, or first phrase, and if any of you are involved in translating, you know all about that business of returning to your first impression of the whole business. So that's very, very suggestive. Another thing that begins, and that you can just see a bit of it, I'll show you more later, but I'm not sure if this pointer is pointing. Oh, good, it is. Right here, that's the end of the translation and the beginning of the commentary. And that AZ is his abbreviation for Azoara, which is his rendering of surah, and he just goes right into a comparison of all the other places where, in his view, a similar topic is being offered, so that in in a rather rough and ready way and in a rather biased Catholic way, Lomellini has provided the first concordance to the Quran in a Western European language, in this case Latin. If you could see the next few lines below this, it would just say, if you go to Surah 44, you'll see this. If you go to Surah 71, you'll see that. Sometimes the connections made are rather far afield, but other times they show a lot of insight and actually some real knowledge. Anyhow, this is what the document looks like. And this passage here at the top, these are also his commentaries and references to other surahs referring to the last ayat of Surah 36. So this is sort of a sample of that. To jump back here for a minute, something else that Lomellini does, he calls ayat perioda. This is periodarum, it's genitive plural, but that's how that's the name that he's decided to use for the surahs. 180 or 96, or maybe it's 90. Now just stop and think about this for a moment. We have the early 20th century Cairo edited edition of the Quran in which the numbers of ayat per surah are specified. We have older documents which sometimes provide variant counts. They're off by a few ayat one way or the other. We have translations such as Marachi's where the translator has rendered them into Latin verses that also show some flexibility in the number of ayat in a surah, but a difference of 100%, 180 to 90, is unbelievable to me and inexplicable. And again, if anyone has any thoughts about how this came to be, Lomellini pays very close attention to the manuscript Qurans that he's working from. If we can assume that he has one manuscript Quran that is numbered, this surah has 180 ayat, the other one has 90, then he is drawing upon resources that simply don't correlate with anything that I've been able to find that was available in Rome or in Western Europe in the early 17th century. It is a truly curious thing. This is one of the most extreme examples, but at the end of the document that I will hope will be published within the year, I go through and look at each one of the surah and note the various options that Lomellini offers. In some, he'll say, this surah has either 115 or 130 or 136 or 137 ayat. So he's got various documents before him that divide up the surah in a very, very different way. But this 180 to 90 is just simply almost beyond belief. It's maybe he's having trouble identifying the breaks between ayat. I don't know, but it's a very strange phenomenon. Coming back to what do you do when the personality or the event or the narrative that you've encountered in the Quran has a relatively close parallel in the Arabic Quran, or the Arabic Quran to the Christian documents. You're probably familiar with the letters that occur at the beginning of many surat. They're variously translated, at least into English, as the broken letters, the unexplained letters, and so on. Lomellini does something that his contemporary translators don't dare do. His fellow translators either don't even acknowledge these mysterious letters, or they simply repeat them without commentary whatsoever. Every single time that these mystery letters appear in the Quran, Lomellini makes an attempt to render them into meaningful Latin words, which in some cases I think can be tracked back to the probable Arabic word that he's thinking of. And in every case, he sees these words as representing attributes of Allah. And in every case, he sees those attributes as positive. And just to pick from the beginning of Surah 19, this is what he's got. Efficace, aut sufficiens, director, fidelium, manus eius, sustenans omnia verax. Those are all things that a homilist preaching a sermon in Latin to a Christian congregation could say about the Christian God. So I cannot at all go far enough to say that by the time that Lomellini has come to the end of translating the Quran, that he's sympathetic to its origins or sympathetic to the people who regard it as a holy book. He's not. He has bad things to say all the way through. However, in a number of instances, he's willing to take a very positive view of ambiguous material that he encounters. Why he is, I'm not sure, because in other cases, he rather seems to deliberately take a very negative view of things that he encounters. But I find this extremely interesting that he's looking at the attributes of God and seeing them as positive, and seeing them as positive with terminology that is completely compatible with Christian terminology. Now, here's an interesting and complicated situation. This is a Hypox Lagaminon, a word appearing only once. Its triliteral root in Arabic draws towards meanings to fear or to terrify. Virtually all translations that I'm aware of regard this word as referring to Christian monks, the idea being that Christian monks are God-fearing individuals. Lomellini seems to know this because he translates it sacerdotia religiosiotum su monacatus, the last word being added later. There's a lot of things added via caret in this. It looks like he went back and added many things. He does not take the opportunity in his commentary to criticize the subsequent text in the Quran which states that the creation of these monasteries, if that's the translation we can go with, were in some way an unsought innovation. He simply reports a connection that he believes he sees with a Christian tradition. It's not a Western Catholic tradition, but it is a Christian tradition. So another thing that we encounter in these early translations and commentaries is where there is simply silence regarding material that might be more negative. And just to mention the most widely available Latin translation of the Quran in Lomellini's time, which was done by Robert of Ketton in the Middle Ages and then published in Zurich in 1543 by Bibliander. There are many places in that, it's almost a paraphrase rather than a translation, where difficult or awkward passages in the Quran simply vanish. And I doubt that the translator was working from a document where they were missing. He simply left it out in its translation. And that's another characteristic of Christian engagement with the Quran more generally in this early period. Again, just a word or two about Germanus here. He also understands that this passage refers to monastic life, but he's decided to focus on fugamque mundi, a flight from the world. Again, that's not spelled out at all in the Arabic. That's something the translator has added. Okay. The Battle of Lepanto will probably be familiar to most of you. It's in history books as a signal defeat of the Sultan's navy by a federation of Christian ships. It occurred during Lomellini's lifetime. He would have been a 6 or 7-year-old boy when it happened, and he would have grown up in Genoa, probably hearing many sailors' tales from eyewitnesses of the event. I'm zooming in on this. This is commentary, not translation. Because one thing that I've come to in spending some years on this translation is that Lomellini is Christian, he is part of Western Europe, but in some ways he is closer in his understanding of the world, both the seen and unseen world, to the environment in which the Quran was revealed than he is to our world in many ways. Lomellini, like his Jesuit colleagues, believes in angels. And I don't think he just is interested in angels as a rhetorical device and saying, oh, we had this Battle of Lepanto and our angels beat up their angels. My read of this is that this navali proelio, this naval battle contra Turcos, was fought with the support of godly angels against bad angels. And this contemporaneous painting, which shows below the two galley navies fighting and then heavenly intervention, I think needs to be taken seriously. And that's a thing that makes publishing and commenting on translations from the early modern period of the Quran tricky, because we need to keep in mind the mindset of the translator and also the mindset of the intended audience. And there are many, many instances where Jesuits of this period are involved in exorcisms and are even speaking to some of the devil's henchmen by specific names that they've been given, and so on. So the miraculous is woven through this. And I would even go so far as to say that Lomellini believed that the Quran was obviously erroneous, misleading, and dangerous, but that the Quran did identify entities like jinn who were real. They were just on the wrong side. They weren't figments, they weren't imaginary. To zoom in on another, here we have the disjointed letters again, Surah 68. And this is a particularly rich little slice. It's also more legible. You can see the damage of the gears running through the middle of this image. But he's taken this nun, which is one of the letters. He has decided to translate it or to understand it as an abbreviation of nur, light, in Arabic. That's pretty straightforward. He's then given two possible translations of nur into Latin. They're not random. They have different theological and liturgical significance. When Christians recite the creed and describe God as light from light, very God from very God, and so on, they're choosing looks here as the word. Lumen has other very specific meanings. And then the rest of this surah is generally entitled Jonah, Yonah. He's making a connection with the fish, and of course, piscis, the fish, all sorts of connotations for Christians. And then lastly, and here I'm speculating, the possibility that nun is also in some way representing the abbreviation for the Arabic word for Christian, with the reference to Nazarene, Jesus of Nazareth. So at any rate, just a particularly nice and rich little glimpse of what he's trying to do with these letters. Sometimes Lomellini really gets stuck. He's really not sure what to do with the word he encounters. In my experience, some of his biggest problems and biggest mistakes involve verbs rather than nouns. Lomellini knows biblical Hebrew. He's a classically formed Jesuit. He also knows, apparently, a good deal of Aramaic because he makes a number of references to Aramaic documents in his marginalia and in his commentary. So here we go. Here's a word. It's dahaba. It's a pretty common Arabic word, perhaps one of the most common verbs. And he's trying to translate it. It has many, many translations: to strike, to set forth, to go away, and so on. But here he has chosen a very harsh and limiting Latin verb for translation, disperdidit, which might be closer to utterly destroy, something like that. And I've worked with some people whose Hebrew is better than mine, and we've come up with some ideas about why Lomellini drew this conclusion. So we have 3 candidates from classical Hebrew, which might bear a rough family resemblance to some of the Arabic. It's not a perfect match in any case, but in each case, my personal favorite maybe is the last one, Trudere, to press. You can see that Lomellini is turning to other Semitic languages to try to translate what he's working on by analogy. My guess is that Lomellini worked on this document in isolation, even though he's in the middle of the city of Rome. He may have consulted Maronite Christians. There was a Maronite Christian school half a mile from the Jesuit house in which he lived, but that basically, because of the sensitive nature of the document that he's working with, I suspect that this was a very solitary undertaking. And I dwell on this for a moment because we have this image of Jesuits, and it's not an incorrect image, there's reasons for it, of all being linked up through a very sophisticated and generally well-functioning network of communication, annual letters, reports to the provincial, correspondence among Jesuits at various levels. And that's true, that's real. And then you even have a personality like Athanasius Kircher, who's also in Rome and who's at the center of all this information that is flowing to him about the Nestorian stelae, about troglodytes that live in Malta, about people in silver mines in Slovakia who think they've seen gnomes and elves. All this stuff is flowing in, and that's all true. But it's also my experience that along with all this communication, there's a tremendous amount of Jesuit isolation. Many Jesuits are working alone. They might be working alone because they're in Tibet, or they're in Tartary, or Mexico. They might be working alone because they've joined the order so that they can be part of a religious order, but they can investigate their own topics of interest in a solitary fashion. They may be working alone because an intermediary in the Jesuit hierarchy has given them quietly the thumbs up. You know, you go ahead and work, just don't make any trouble while you're working. And I think all the way through this manuscript, Lomellini's commentaries, his comments to himself, his attempts to work out some of these problems in solitude is very different from if he was trying to translate something out of Russian that wouldn't be as politically sensitive as the Quran, or religiously sensitive. So there's this isolation that is, I think, something in the history of Baroque Jesuits that needs to be brought to the fore more. We need to think about Jesuits as isolated people on occasions. Well, to come back to those disjointed words just for a moment, here's an instance where Lomellini even goes further than he has in offering attributes of God based on his understanding of Arabic lying behind initials. He's actually got God speaking here in the first person. So here is Lomellini, comfortable, presenting without negative commentary, God speaking in the Quran, ego Deus misericors aut nutriens. Let me speak for a moment, I know there isn't that much time left, on some things that he gets terribly wrong. This word occurs in Surah 24, Ayah 35. It refers in all probability to pearls. I hope I'm right about that. That's what I think that it refers to. Something shining. Lomellini completely is off on this. One thing I should say about Jesuit culture in Lomellini's time and for a long time after, there's a constant search for equivalencies. That's a phrase that I owe to Peter Davison, a colleague. But this search for equivalencies is both a tremendous strength of Jesuits on occasion. They are able, somewhat later, a Jesuit is able to look at Sanskrit and say, there are things about this that look a lot like Latin. Equivalencies, links are very useful, but sometimes equivalencies go completely wrong. Lomellini thinks this has something to do with the constellation Orion. And he then goes a step further and finds a citation. I believe it's in the Bucolics of Orion being the constellation that precedes rainfall, pluvia causans. So he goes off and says that this is a reference to this constellation, and it's about rain coming, and it has basically nothing at all to do with that. And I'll just mention, on other occasions, Lomellini doesn't even try to translate an Arabic word, and sometimes that word is very surprising. There is a surah towards the end of the Quran called the elephant, Ifil. Lomellini has no idea what that means. He just transliterates it. Now, that someone, and that's still the word for elephant, someone living in the Mediterranean world, in Rome, can't find someone who could tell him that this is the word for elephant is truly puzzling. And I don't have an airtight explanation other than this whole project was really under wraps. And he was really not comfortable talking to anyone about it. But perhaps there are other explanations. Okay. Christian translators of the Quran have various ways in this period of demolishing the Quran. One of the favorite ways is to criticize the Prophet Muhammad for his lack of intelligence, his lack of education, his low social status, or his moral dubiousness, or all of those things, if you like. Lomellini is an aristocrat. He is part of a religious order that greatly prizes high social standing, to the degree that Jesuits, when describing a drama that they produced that was staged at one of their schools, will often say, there were this many people of senatorial rank, this many who were knights, this many who were solid upper patrician citizens. It's very important to connect nobility and high social standing with the project. So, in the commentary, in Surah 26, he quotes from Horace. There are many, many quotes from Horace woven through not the translation but the commentaries of Lomellini. And he's just making a dig. You know, he's saying this is the sort of thing that would be known to gossips and barbers. Two populations that would never be Jesuit priests officially. So there's two things going on here. One is it's a put down of the prophet. Another thing is he's flattering his audience, because he knows that at least some of his audience will know this quote from their own classical education, which they may well have received from Jesuits themselves. Okay, now that's a very brief collection of postcards, if you will, about a very large document to just sort of give you a sample of the issues and the possibilities that are at hand. I was talking with a British colleague of mine about this project a couple of years ago, and he asked a question that is a very legitimate question, the sort of question that my students would call the so what question. He said, and I'll just tell you, we were at All Souls College, Oxford, if that means anything to you for the context. It's interesting, but is it significant? This is a question that I think needs to be asked about any manuscript which is identified as having been written by someone who produced no publications that are known, and in the case of translations, started no genealogy. Because Quran translations, like other translations, have a genealogy. Later translations are often influenced by earlier ones, and particularly in the case of the Quran, you end up with vernacular translations, an English translation being based on a French translation, a Dutch translation being based on a German translation. Lomellini has none of these things going for him. This is a dead end. This manuscript vanished from sight until 1806, when Sylvestre de Sacy, a very notable Orientalist in the Napoleonic era, obtained it and wrote on the flyleaf that it was a pretty good translation. After his death, it was auctioned off with the rest of his library, and by the late 1840s, it has turned up in the university library in Genoa. I suspect, I have no proof, but I suspect purchased by a Genoan who may well have been a Lomellini himself or herself, and then returned to the city where the author had been born. The manuscript then sits and no one pays any attention to it until well into the latter part of the 20th century. So I would argue that it's significant, and I'm happy to discuss this with you, for three reasons. It sheds light on what the Jesuits have called and still call their way of proceeding, which very often has been about dealing with non-European, non-Christian cultures. How close do you get? How sympathetic do you allow yourself to become? How immersed in the linguistic evidence do you become? And this is an issue when you look at Alexandre de Rode, who basically created the alphabet that is now used with Vietnamese. It's an issue with Jesuits who came to Nouvelle France, who worked with Huron languages and other languages. And it's certainly an issue in East Asia where Jesuits master Mandarin Chinese and are later accused, denounced, and expelled as a result of their accusers saying, you've become too close to Confucianism. Secondly, I think it's interesting and significant because it sheds light on the role of Neo-Latin well into the 17th century as an international language and as a language which was still accessible not simply to a handful of highly trained specialists in law or theology or science, but an audience that Lomellini, I think, intended this manuscript to reach, which would have probably been the cardinal and his circle of friends. And I would argue that Neo-Latin, until recently, has been viewed as the sort of pallid encore of Renaissance Latin, and that actually it's a much more lively and enduring mode of communication than we realize. And I would argue this manuscript puts this forward. Thirdly, Europe, 1622, the 30 Years' War is underway. Protestant and Catholic are fighting, and Protestants are fighting among themselves, and everybody's fighting the Unitarians. And in that environment, one of the biggest insults that Martin Luther, for example, can hurl at a pope is to say, you're more Turkish than the Turk. And other groups hurl that back. A conservative French bishop preaches a sermon that accuses the Jesuits of having a, quote, Quranic theology. A lot of the polemic that runs through just about every page of this document is driven, in my view, not by any insight or even any hatred of Islam, but of inter-Christian hostility. Christianity has broken apart. It's not coming back together institutionally. It feels very vulnerable spiritually, and now very vulnerable physically by the presence of the Ottoman Empire, which is not even able in its most further advanced state, the sieges of Vienna, to reunite Christendom. I think a lot of the invective that is in this document comes from that. I've mentioned the snapshot of translation in progress already. This has been extremely valuable to me in my own studies of classical Arabic, and I'll tell you quite honestly, I've made some of the same mistakes Lomellini has made, and it's made me wonder, how come I did that too? What is it about my way of thinking or my limitations or my resources that 400 years later, 399 years later, causes me to stumble in the wrong direction? It's been enlightening. And then lastly, and I want to spend a moment or two on this, we may not live in a Christian world in Europe and in North America today, Christian majority, but we still live in a Western world where assumptions and values start from very different places than they start for people who regard the Quran as the revealed truth of God. And I was just mentioning to George on the way over here, I went to a conference a couple of years ago in Berlin where many of the luminaries of Christian study of the Quran were present, and many other people, but not one Muslim scholar was present. Imagine, in the middle of the city of Berlin, with hundreds of thousands of Muslims in residence, we were operating in as much of a seclusion as Lomellini's audience would have operated in some soiree in Rome 4 centuries earlier. Bound up in this is the challenge of most of us needing to rely on experts or self-described experts in the Quran and Quranic literature when we read about current events. And I think of the recent Taliban seizure of Afghanistan and the number of commentators in the best presses coming forward and telling us what these Taliban people believe in and what parts of the Quran they go to for what it is that they believe in. And for virtually all of us, except for a few subject matter specialists, we have to accept that interpretation. That challenge remains. Arabic, at least for me, is a very, very hard language. It is a barrier to understanding. It requires more of an investment than most of us have lifestyles that we can pursue this. So I think one of the purposes of investigating this is that although this document lies a millennium after the revelation of the Quran, and although it has many flaws and many weaknesses, it is extremely enlightening as an example of a sincere and conscientious, if very biased, Jesuit's attempt to understand a document that he knew was extremely important, even if he was out to discount it wherever he could. And I would hope, in a small way, that continuing to study these early translations will encourage more people to take the Quran seriously as a document as well. And I think I will close now so that there's time for questions. Thank you so much for your patience.